We need strong alliances in Europe to give us the broadest possible political and economic base with which to compete with China.
The work that began in the wake of 2014 and Russia's invasion of Ukraine and illegal annexation of Crimea in terms of the European reassurance work that then was transformed into the deterrence work.
Senators Portman and Murphy are committed transatlanticists who embody visionary, bipartisan leadership.
We have to form close partnerships with allies who share our values, and that's going to be critical, having a global anti-disinformation network.
I believe the biggest task of the transatlantic community will be to defend democracy in the face of unprecedented challenges from countries like Russia and China.
Hello, and welcome to the fifth and final day of CEPA Forum. If you're just tuning in, my name is Geisha Gonzalez, and I am the Senior Director for Programs and Strategy at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA. I'd like to give a special thank you to our supporters for this week's forum: NATO's Public Diplomacy Division, Lockheed Martin Corporation, Bell Helicopter, American Friends of Czech Republic, and Friends of Slovakia. Thank you all for making this happen. As you're tuning in, please be sure to use hashtag CEPA Forum or go to cepaforum.org to submit your questions for today's panel. And now it is my honor to welcome our Transatlantic Leadership Fellows and Alumni as they introduce the 2020 Transatlantic Leadership Award.
My name is Katarzyna Pisarska, and I'm from Poland.
Ania Lacic, I'm from Romania.
Matthew Brown from the United States of America.
Veronika Vichova from the Czech Republic.
Austin Doler from the United States of America.
Thomas Liptak from Czech Republic.
Leon Hartswell, and I'm from the United States.
Olga Zykova, and I'm from Ukraine.
Sharka Prat from the Czech Republic.
As my generation looks at the world today, we see a future that looks uncertain,
and in which the transatlantic alliance will face some of its greatest challenges.
Russian aggression,
China's rise,
malign influence,
corruption and kleptocracy,
disruptive technologies,
transatlantic divisions,
the threats of climate change,
and disinformation.
But we also see a future full of opportunity to work together.
Across generations.
Across political divides.
Across peoples.
Across the internet.
Across economies.
Across cyberspace.
Across borders.
And across the Atlantic.
To build a shared vision and purpose.
Between nations.
Between neighbors.
Between governments and civil society.
Between partners and allies.
Between North America and Europe.
While the challenges we face may seem insurmountable, they are not.
Because we can only build a better tomorrow for my generation and the next generation together.
As a community of nations bound by our shared values and principles.
And for that, we need visionary leaders.
Driven by the commitment of our shared purpose of creating a future free from tyranny.
Free from repression.
Free from authoritarianism.
We need leaders in the 21st century, willing and ready to face the challenges we know
and those that are still yet to come.
With vision and courage to defend our democracies.
Senator Rob Portman and Senator Chris Murphy embody this vision of leadership.
At a time when it feels that there is more that divides us than unites us.
Senators Murphy and Portman have shown what is possible when we work together.
As we look ahead at an uncertain future, we will need more leaders like Senators Portman and Murphy to have the vision.
the foresight,
and the fearlessness to put our alliance,
our nations, our people first.
Our 2020 Transatlantic Leadership awardees.
Thank you, CEPA's Transatlantic Leadership Fellows. It's our honor to present the Transatlantic Leadership Award to Senator Rob Portman of Ohio and Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. Senators Portman and Murphy are committed transatlanticists who embody visionary, bipartisan leadership. Senators Portman and Murphy were first to recognize the threat that Russian disinformation poses to our democracies. The Countering Foreign Propaganda and Disinformation Act of 2016, which they co-sponsored and later became law, enabled the United States to begin countering state-sponsored disinformation campaigns. Today, the Global Engagement Center at the U.S. State Department is working with our allies and partners to coordinate transatlantic efforts to identify and expose foreign disinformation. Without their work, we would be more vulnerable and less prepared to respond to foreign malign influence from Russia, China, and others. Their foresight, vision, and ability to work together across political divides have defined both senators' careers, from strengthening security in Ukraine to ensuring Western democratic resilience in the face of authoritarianism. These efforts have made the transatlantic community safer, more stable, and more resilient. For this work, this vision, and this commitment to democratic values, CEPA is honored to recognize Senator Rob Portman and Senator Chris Murphy with our 2020 Transatlantic Leadership Award.
Hi, I'm U.S. Senator Rob Portman. I'm really honored to receive the Transatlantic Leadership Award from the Center for European Policy Analysis at your 2020 forum. Thank you very much. And thanks to Elena Polikova and for CEPA for this honor and for the opportunity to speak with you about an issue that's becoming increasingly relevant to America's shared policy goals with our allies in Europe, and that's the spread of state-sponsored disinformation. Particularly in today's digital world, information is power. And democracies like ours require a well-informed electorate to function properly. But Russia, China, Iran, and other adversaries of democracy are waging campaigns to systematically distort publicly available information, to twist facts and distort the truth to an unsuspecting populace. This tactic is relatively inexpensive, it has a high degree of deniability, and if left unchecked, it can really be effective and devastatingly so. In 2016, my colleague, Democrat Senator Chris Murphy, and I introduced legislation to establish an organization within the U.S. government to help lead the interagency fight against global disinformation and to work with our international partners on a unified response. The resulting legislation we passed is called the Global Engagement Center. It's within the State Department. GEC is the central nexus of our work to create this effective shield against falsehoods that threaten the integrity of our democracy. There are numerous examples of this happening just in the past few years. Here in the U.S., of course, we now have extensive documentation that state-sponsored Russian actors conducted a coordinated interference campaign in our 2016 elections, something we all need to work hard to prevent in this election cycle. Across the Atlantic, Ukraine has been the subject of a sustained Russian disinformation campaign in response to its efforts to break free of Moscow's influence since its 2014 Revolution of Dignity. We're seeing a rise in these tactics from China as well, both in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe. It's truly a global problem that requires, in my view, an integrated global response. I'm thankful that groups like CEPA have recognized not just the gravity of this threat, but are working to bring attention to the issue. The threat of disinformation is now a global discussion across the globe, when it was not only a few years ago. The problems created by deliberate state-sponsored manipulation of information are going to be here for a long time, and we need to continue to focus on it. Perhaps the most important thing is to realize this threat is that we can't do it alone. It can't be just the United States. We have to form close partnerships with allies who share our values. And that's going to be critical, having a global anti-disinformation network. Through the Global Engagement Center, GEC, and other agencies, we've begun to establish close and effective relationships with our European counterparts, as an example, and our joint efforts are starting to gain traction. The importance of working with our partners extends beyond the disinformation sphere, however. The transatlantic community faces a lot of challenges ahead of us. This year, of course, the challenge for everyone has been COVID-19, causing this global pandemic that's killed so many people and greatly restricted the economies of many countries, making it even more difficult in a way for us and our allies to defend our open and rules-based international order. Another challenge we face together, of course, is the aggressive expansionist agenda of Russia. We've seen it in Belarus recently as President Lukashenko has sought Russian help in trying to hold on to power after a sham election. We've got to stand together and display strength and resolve in the face of Russia's attempts to intimidate their neighbors. I know the United States, along with our partners in Europe, stand with the people of Belarus in their fight for free, open, and fair elections. Again, our efforts to combat disinformation, COVID-19, and expansionist Russia are stronger when we work together. All of these challenges require that we work together to reinforce our values. It also reinforces our need for NATO and the importance of multilateral cooperation. The NATO alliance is really important to both the United States and Europe, and while from time to time we must strategically analyze our force posture and ensure we're properly positioned to face emerging threats, nothing should shake our commitment to each other and our mutual defense. Just this year, the Atlantic Council voted in Ukraine as a member of NATO's Enhanced Opportunity Partner Program. I think that was a very positive step for Ukraine and for NATO. By the way, they were then joining the ranks of Australia, Finland, Georgia, Jordan, and Sweden. NATO continues to be the strongest multilateral organization for ensuring the common defense of our international norms and security and our way of life. Thank you all for your commitment to combat disinformation all around the world. The United States must continue to stand against those who would seek to undermine the democratic values we and our allies hold so dear. I'll continue to work with Senator Murphy and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle in Congress to ensure that we are doing our part to carry out that important mission. Godspeed in your critical work.
Hi, this is Senator Chris Murphy. I'm so pleased to join the 2020 CEPA Forum, and I'm especially honored today to receive the Transatlantic Leadership Award. Especially pleased to receive it along with my friend Senator Rob Portman. Senator Portman and I started working together on this issue of combating disinformation way back in 2015. Feels like a lifetime ago now, as part of our shared interest in supporting Ukraine and combating Russian aggression in the region. Back then, state-sponsored disinformation was considered a problem primarily for countries in Russia's near abroad. There were a variety of unofficial working groups in the US government, but there really wasn't any one entity that was charged with coordinating US efforts to combat propaganda and disinformation, especially coming out of Russia. The Global Engagement Center at that time was only focused on propaganda from terrorist groups. But Rob and I had been watching Russian propaganda at work in Ukraine for over a year, and we saw all the ways that the Russians were promoting fake news stories in Europe as well as influencing domestic Russian audiences. It was one prong in their massive campaign that also included and still includes bribery, corruption, energy bullying, and the financing of political parties and NGOs, all designed to undermine democratic governments and increase Russia's political leverage. So Rob and I recognized that these efforts on behalf of Russia had the potential to really undermine all the work that we were doing as a US government to support Ukraine and everything the Ukrainians were doing to try to stand up a new government and do the hard work of dismantling the corruption networks that had kept Ukraine tied to Russia for all those years. So we figured that it really wouldn't matter how many tanks or javelins we gave Ukraine if the Kremlin could convince people living in the Donbass that there was a terrorist junta in Kyiv that wanted to impose fascism on their children and outlaw the Russian language. So Putin's hybrid war militarized these pre-existing divisions in Ukraine, and we saw, just like you saw, that propaganda was a deadly weapon. So our legislation authorized the relatively small, then, Global Engagement Center to beef up and coordinate a whole of government strategy to take on this threat. And we expand the GEC's mission to counter state-sponsored propaganda and disinformation. We made the case that fighting Russian propaganda in Europe was a national security priority that was just as important as our efforts to deter Russia's military activities. But what seemed like a problem that threatened to undermine our foreign policy agenda in Ukraine in 2015 suddenly became a threat to America's own democracy just a year later, during the 2016 presidential election. In some ways, we've come a long way since that wake-up call. The US sanctioned a number of Russian officials, including Dmitry Prigozhin, whose diverse portfolio of unsavory activities included running the infamous troll farm, known as the Information Research Agency, and sending Russian mercenaries with the Wagner Group to fight unofficially on behalf of Putin's interests in Ukraine, Libya, and Syria. The GEC is finally up and running now, supporting independent journalism in Belarus and producing reports in real time about foreign disinformation around COVID-19. And most Americans are now at least aware of the possibility that Russia is planning to interfere in the 2020 presidential election. But even with all that progress, we are still very vulnerable. There's no doubt that the Russian government intends to try to rig this election, just as they interfered in the 2016 presidential election, the Catalan independence referendum, and the Brexit vote. But the Trump administration is not being upfront with the American people. A DHS whistleblower revealed that US officials have been ordered not to share relevant information about Russian interference and to modify intelligence reports to bring them in line with the president's comments. This is a disaster, and it's harmful to our national security. Russians are not Republicans. Their blacklist includes senators of both parties. I have seen the intelligence, and I believe that much more needs to be shared publicly about Russia's intent and their capability to interfere and try to manipulate the 2020 elections. Otherwise, what is the point of spending billions of dollars collecting all of this information on foreign governments that are trying to manipulate US politics if we're not going to use that information to try to help the American people protect themselves from a foreign threat? What I can share with you is that the Kremlin's methods are evolving. They are deploying techniques that they perfected in Ukraine, like using actual Americans to launder fake news and conspiracy theories that are meant to inflame partisan divides and help their preferred candidates, like President Trump. Unlike trolls and bots, if an unwitting American promotes a story from a fringe website, they can't be shut down, or at least it's a lot harder to shut them down. The social media companies are taking the threat more seriously than in 2016, but right now we are still seeing the Russians flooding Facebook and Twitter and other sites with disinformation. Over half of the content on Twitter today regarding coronavirus is likely coming from foreign sources. Think about that. Over half of all of the information that you are reading on social media platforms that you trust are coming from foreign sources, much of it from Russia. Of the content on social media regarding Reopen America campaigns, right, these campaigns to get rid of social distancing requirements at the state level, research suggests that 60 to 70% of all of that Reopen America content is foreign-based propaganda, most likely coming from Russia. Clearly, our deterrence measures haven't been sufficient. It's important for us to remember that democracies are really fragile things. Our open societies make us vulnerable. The best way to defend ourselves is to be clear about these threats, transparent about these threats, and ensure our population is educated in media literacy and critical thinking skills. Finland and the Baltic states They have a lot to teach us, having been on the front lines of Russia's hybrid war a lot longer than most. We also have to do a better job at healing the societal divisions that adversaries exploit. Right here in the United States, for example, the Senate Intelligence Committee found that in 2016, the Russian Information Research Agency specifically targeted African Americans to exploit, these are their words, social fractures and erode trust in media entities, in government, in each other, and in democracy itself. This year, independent analysts have found Russia is also promoting articles about BLM mobs and anti-white racism, with the goal simply being to sow more division. Finally, we have to protect our own democracies from creeping authoritarianism and support organic pro-democracy movements like what's happening in Belarus today. Almost every democracy in history ended in authoritarianism, beginning with the ancient Greeks. The modern incarnation of democracy is clearly not immune to these impulses. To answer the challenge posed by the title of this year's conference, Mapping the Next Transatlantic Decade, I believe the biggest task of the transatlantic community will be to defend democracy in the face of unprecedented challenges from countries like Russia and China, which in very different ways are trying to convince the world that democracy is overrated, outdated, that it's failed, and that their versions of authoritarianism are actually preferable. Now, I don't believe that argument will be convincing, but for us to beat that argument, we actually have to do the work. You're engaged in that work. And though I'm sad that this has to be via remote connection, I want to congratulate CEPA in being one of the strongest organizational voices urging Washington to take this threat to democracy seriously. You issued this charge early on, and you're re-upping it today. CEPA's former president, Wes Mitchell, and his team provided significant support to the GEC legislation as we worked to get it passed and signed into law. CEPA's new president, Dr. Polyakova, is perhaps one of the nation's foremost experts on Russia and disinformation. So I know that we will be all looking to CEPA as a resource on these issues and so many more in the years to come. Thank you so much for this recognition. Thanks so much for having me, and I look forward to cooperating in the coming year.
Hopefully he'll come on.
Thank you, Senators Rob Portman and Senator Chris Murphy, and congratulations on being awarded the 2020 Transatlantic Leadership Award. And now it is my honor to turn it over to our Vice Chair of our board, Wes Mitchell, in conversation with Derek Chollet, who is the Executive Vice President for Security and Defense Policy at the German Marshall Fund, as they talk about U.S. priorities and foreign policy for the next administration. Over to you.
I think if you follow the headlines, what you see most are the disagreements, of course. So that would be the place to start. Politically and atmospherically, that's what dominates the headlines. So disagreements between the United States and Europe on trade, on burden sharing and defense, on Nord Stream 2, and those disagreements are not inconsequential. But I think you also have to see that in most cases, they're rooted in structural rather than temporary things, right? So in most cases, the disagreements between the United States and at least many of the major European countries predate the Trump administration, and they're going to be here. They will be with us alive and well, whatever happens in November. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. The interesting question in my mind, Derek, I don't know how you see this, but I think it's whether America's relationship with Europe today is where it needs to be vis-a-vis the main strategic challenge facing the United States, facing U.S. statecraft in our time. And I would say that's the challenge of great power competition, and particularly the need to deal with the rise of China. And here I think it is a little bit different picture than the headlines. I think, clearly alliances should be our greatest, or one of our greatest assets for long-term competition with China. And specifically, I think the ability to rally countries of the West around a unified, or at least reasonably aligned agenda strategically and economically. I think we've made considerable progress in elevating China, in particular, as a major point of focus for U.S. diplomacy in Europe. We're a lot more engaged today in many of the regions that are most vulnerable in Europe to Chinese penetration. So Southern Europe, Western Balkans, Central and Eastern Europe, Eastern Med. So I think beneath the surface, there is a lot more convergence between the United States and even the EU and some of the larger member states of the EU that we have disagreements with than is commonly understood. And the way I would put it is, I think the elements are in place to build out a more comprehensive strategic agenda between the United States and Europe. And it's a question of whether the next administration, in whatever garb, will grab that opportunity, and it's going to require give and take on both sides. Derek, I don't know if that makes sense to you or what your views are.
Yeah, I think, look, I think you're absolutely right that there are some underlying structural trends that have impacted the transatlantic relationship going back now across at least 3 administrations, because I carry some of this back to the second Bush administration. And that in some respects, the relationship's better than it sounds. And that if you look under the hood, and particularly in the security relationship, I would say, the work that began in the wake of 2014 and Russia's invasion of Ukraine and illegal annexation of Crimea, in terms of the European reassurance work that then was transformed into the deterrence work carried forward by this administration, the increased funding for U.S. force presence in Europe, some of the specific deployment decisions that have been made. You could tell a story of continuity. But yet there are examples, and some pretty important examples for the transatlantic relationship, that I think are not just structural challenges. Clearly a different administration, a Biden administration, would have a different approach to climate change, for example, which is an issue extremely important to the European side, very important, should be very important to the American side, and clearly a new administration is going to have a different approach to climate change. Similarly on Iran, and Iran is an example that of, I would say, of great U.S.-European cooperation going back in the Obama years, leading the JCPOA. I actually believe there was potential, and West was part of some of this when he was in office, potential for greater cooperation with the Europeans who agreed with the argument coming from the American side on the Iran nuclear deal, that there was flaws in the deal, there were holes in it, issues that were not addressed. And there was a genuine a real conversation happening with Europeans in 2017 and into 2018 to try to strengthen the deal. But the decision was taken to pull out altogether. And I don't see that has brought us closer. Similarly, I think and again, we could attribute this to atmospherics, but nevertheless, this is happening. The kind of debate about the U.S. commitment to NATO, a debate that, regardless of the earnest rhetoric coming out from below the level of the president, that nevertheless is something that, for very good reasons, is on many people's minds about what would happen in a second term if Trump were reelected, vis-a-vis the U.S. and its commitment to Article 5, since the president's own personal views on the alliance are pretty well known and pretty, in my views, indisputable on this. The last point I should say on China, because I agree very much with Wes that this is an area that I think we've seen growing convergence between the U.S. and Europe on the acknowledgement of the threat from China, and I think that in part because of the efforts of the U.S. government across 2 administrations to try to really engage with the Europeans on the challenges of the Asia Pacific, but China specifically. Also, let's face it, because of China's behavior, the Europeans now, I think, get it. I'll start, and maybe this makes Wes's answer easier. I don't think the damage is irreparable. Yes, it's true. Things have been said that can't be unsaid. And I suppose there will always be lingering doubt in the minds of some European partners that the vein that President Trump has tapped into that expresses deep skepticism about alliances and their value to America's national interest and frankly misunderstanding of alliances like NATO just in terms of how they operate, that could always that has always been within our bloodstream, those views, and they could always come back. But I actually look at this, and maybe this is I'll chalk this up to being an eternal optimist perhaps, but that my European colleagues see the public opinion polling showing still overwhelming support for alliance like NATO, understanding that those alliances do have to work and that Europeans need to do their fair share. And as Wes pointed out earlier, the burden sharing debate is not going anywhere. In fact, it's probably only going to get harder as the economic crisis because of COVID settles in on both sides of the Atlantic. But I think that that a new administration, particularly if it's a President Biden, who is so well known in Europe, who for decades has worked in the trenches on this relationship, whether from Capitol Hill or from the executive branch, and really understands it. I think there's a lot of the damage that has happened is not irreparable.
Well, I agree with some of what Derek has said. I will say I think some of this is substance, some of it is tone, but the reality is from one administration to the next, I think there's often slippage, and in some ways, with the Obama administration, I think you had in Europe the appearance of engagement, but in some ways the reality of disengagement. And the opposite with the Trump administration. In some ways you've had the appearance of disengagement, but the reality of engagement. And with Obama, it's important to remember, and Derek alluded to a couple of these policy decisions, but Obama came into office with the decision to not move forward with U.S. missile defense sites in Poland and the Czech Republic. We had the pivot to Asia, which Derek mentioned. Obviously, the U.S.-Russia reset, which I think was very discomforting to a number of U.S. allies in Central Europe. We withdrew the last BCTs from Europe. But the perception was that the administration was engaging more deeply in Europe. I think with the Trump administration, in some ways, as I said, you've had the opposite. We've had upwards of 150, 160 U.S.-led military exercises in Europe in the last few years, an increased tempo of U.S. diplomacy, as I mentioned a minute ago, in Central Europe, Western Balkans, Eastern Med. So I think it's important to bear that in mind. I'll take a crack at that. I mean, as I said a minute ago, I think the main objective broadly for U.S. policy in Europe has to be to bring our relationships in that region into better alignment with the main U.S. strategic requirements for an era of great power competition. And I think this is where the National Defense Strategy has outlined some objectives that will not be perishable for the United States. I think they're going to be with us for a while. And that also imposes some clarity and discipline in how we think about our policy in a lot of regions in the world, and certainly in Europe. I think the main feature of great power competition is economic, diplomatic, technological, ideological competition, particularly with China. And if you accept that premise, I think a couple of things follow for the United States in terms of our priorities in Europe. One, and I think it's the biggest one, is Western political cohesion. That we need strong alliances in Europe to give us the broadest possible political and economic base with which to compete with China, both globally and in key regions. And to my mind, that implies the need for a U.S.-Europe agenda that is more comprehensive than what we've talked about at pretty much any point since the end of the Cold War. It's not just trade, but regulatory and ethical standards in emerging and disruptive technology. So there's definitely a strong digital component to that agenda that is underdeveloped. It's the reform of international institutions. So the WTO, for example, United Nations, when the United States and Europe jointly tackle what I think should be a voluntary and a proactive renovation of those institutions, we're stronger when we do that together. I think it's also military technological. So for the United States, through NATO, United States and Europe to maintain a key edge in a lot of the technologies that will determine life and death and victory on the battlefield. The second priority, which that alludes to, and I think it's just as important, is military. And that is to ensure our ability to secure what would be probably a secondary theater in the event of major conflict in order to enable U.S. forces to prioritize Asia.
I can make this easy because I agree with almost everything you've said. I mean, it seems to me, and I'll just underscore a couple things that come to mind for me, which is obviously climate change is going to be, should be first and foremost on the agenda. And, you know, as though we need further reminder of that, watching the wildfires on our West Coast here in the U.S. is just further evidence of the urgency of that issue. And we've lost a lot of time in the last few years on that, I think, and that's one that the U.S. and our European partners need to be leading on. Second, and related to that, as we've discussed, is China. And this is an area where I do think there is potential, in part from the hard work done by U.S. administrations to try to pull the Europeans into the conversation a little more, but also they're being pushed there by Chinese behavior. But whether it relates to the economic consequences of China's rise, the security aspects, and what we need to be thinking about militarily if we were to enter into some sort of armed conflict with China, and what that would mean for our security interests in Europe. It's a really important piece of business that we need to look into with the Europeans. And then finally, the democratic crisis in the United States, we are still in the opening stages of. And a lot is going to depend on if we were to have a change of administration, how the current president handles that. It's hard for me to see a scenario where we're going to have what looks like a normal transition, you know, as we've become accustomed to. That is going to matter a lot for the transatlantic relationship. And I think that in some ways we need a democratic renewal, small d democratic renewal in the US and in Europe. That's going to have to start here in the US and be part of the transatlantic conversation. But the three-headed crises that we're facing here, the pandemic, the economic crisis that's sparked by the pandemic, but it is accentuating some structural issues that have been there all along in terms of the U.S. economy and the widening gap between those at the top and those at the bottom, and the racial reckoning, the reckoning that we're having with the systemic racism in the United States, which is long overdue, and it's demographically inevitable. It's going to be a huge impact on the future of U.S. foreign policy writ large, but particularly the transatlantic relationship.
Thank you, Derek, and thank you, Wes, for that exhilarating conversation. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Milda Boyce, who is the director of the Transatlantic Leadership Program, who will introduce today's discussion.
Hello, I am Milda Boyce, Director of the Transatlantic Leadership Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington, D.C. Our team is dedicated to empowering world-class leadership and strengthening ties across the Atlantic and among Atlanticists everywhere. Every day, leaders around the globe make critical decisions that are instrumental in shaping our future. Today's generation of leaders is confronted with global uncertainty, new security threats, and challenges to democratic unity. In response to these challenges, we strive to empower and engage emerging leaders to build stronger transatlantic ties, develop innovative solutions, and reinvigorate our shared democratic values and principles. Tomorrow's leaders are here today in the public sector, in private industry, and in civil society. Our task is to identify and connect these individuals to bring about positive change. Above all, our team strives to reimagine leadership for the 21st century. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce our next panel on the future of transatlantic leadership, moderated by a stalwart Atlanticist, CEPA Senior Fellow Edward Lucas. Edward has dedicated his life and professional career to strengthening transatlantic bonds through painstaking analysis and carefully fostered relationships on both sides of the Atlantic. Edward, thank you for your leadership. Over to you.
Hello, I'm Edward Lucas. I'm Senior Fellow at the Centre for European Policy Analysis, and I would like to welcome all the people watching on the different forms of electronic device to our final panel of the CEPA Forum, The Future of Transatlantic Leadership. I'm very pleased to welcome my panelists. We have the Honourable Brendan Boyle, who is the representative for Pennsylvania's 2nd District in the US House of Representatives. Congressman, welcome, and thank you very much for your forceful and very timely intervention in the British debate about Brexit and Northern Ireland. You're a big figure here in the UK. We have Rachel Hoff, who's Policy Director for the Ronald Reagan Institute. I recommend Rachel's tweets, clips of Ronald Reagan's speeches from an era when perhaps white was a bit whiter and black was a bit blacker in terms of right and wrong. Constanze Stelzenmüller, a fellow think tanker, Senior Fellow for Foreign Policy at the Centre on United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution, and someone who I feel is equally at home in North America, in continental Europe, and also in the UK, where she explains things to us in her column in the Financial Times, which is a must read. Then we've got the Right Honourable Tom Tugendhat, former colonel. He likes to be addressed these days as chairman, he says, only joking. He is indeed chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Commons here in London, and has just been highlighting the danger of Chinese economic imperialism in the Caribbean, which is a very hot topic here. Barbados has decided it wants to be a republic and no longer have the Queen as head of state. And then finally, my old friend Tomáš Valášek, known to many of us as a think tanker, also a diplomat. That's why he's Your Excellency, having eaten his peas as Slovakia's representative in Brussels at NATO, but now chairman of the European Committee of the Slovak Parliament. Welcome to all of you. I should say to the audience that if you want to submit questions, please send them with hashtag CEPA Forum on social media or visit cepaforum.org. So I want to start with just a quick round of questions to get from all of you your take on the future of transatlantic leadership. Does it have one? It seems to me that there's a leadership vacuum. It's been particularly visible over Belarus, where Lithuania has been absolutely fantastic, leading the free world in its response to the crisis, but a notable absence of leadership certainly from the executive branch in the United States and also from the European Union. So let's go in the same order that I introduced our panelists. Congressman Boyle, is there a leadership vacuum?
Easy answer, yes. Yeah, this is probably the most, first, by the way, it's a pleasure to be with all of you, and thank you. This is probably the most quiet the United States has been on the world stage in my entire lifetime, and I think it's noticeable in Belarus, but I think that it will continue to play out as long as this administration is in existence.
And Rachel, you must feel, looking with your position as the sort of custodian of the Reagan legacy. If Ronald Reagan was president, he'd probably be standing on the Belarusian border right now, giving a fantastic speech against a backdrop of flags and berating President Lukashenko. But we don't live in that era anymore now, do we?
Right. I mean, we can't claim to know what our 40th president would have said, but in this moment, but I think we know the principles that he would have stood for, and they're the ones that indeed he stood for throughout his presidency. And I think the ones that animated, decades of American leadership on both sides of the aisle. We have a tradition of that. And to your question, I think we are seeing a leadership vacuum right now. Belarus is certainly one instance of that. I think, slower condemnations than many would have liked to have seen of the poisoning of Alexei Navalny. I think, even when it comes to broader, more enduring challenges like China, we are seeing a vacuum of leadership, and whether it has a future, whether transatlantic leadership has a future or not, I guess what I would say is it needs one.
And Constanze, you are, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for wearing the Belarusian colours. That's very much appreciated and makes me feel my tie is very, very boring in comparison. But there's often a tendency in Europe to bemoan the lack of American leadership or complain that American leadership is going wrong. Due to the fact that Europe is actually bigger in population terms, bigger in GDP terms than the United States, does transatlantic leadership always have to come from that side of the Atlantic, or maybe it should be coming from our side of the Atlantic, from Europe? I think you may be muted, Constance.
Let me start over. I think that's a false binary. And I think, it's regrettable when there's no American leadership. Although I will say, I think there has been quite a lot of quiet action from the State Department and other places. And I would trust someone like Steve Biegun to say and do the right thing, but one would prefer it, obviously, to come from the White House. On the European side, as we all know, significant sanctions are currently being hung up over the Greece-Turkey debate by Cyprus, which is just extraordinarily regrettable and shameful for Europe. I'm glad that at least Germany took in Navalny and helped him get well. I have other concerns concerning pipelines and things like that, but this isn't good enough, and I think we have to do better.
Now, the first of our two Toms, Tom Tugendhat, there was a lot of very excited talk among the Brexiters that Brexit would unleash Britain's capability and we'd be playing a much more prominent role in world affairs. Other people thought we might be there'd be less leadership from Britain because we'd be sort of diminished. What's your take on where we are now? Do you feel that Britain is making the most of the opportunities for being the country that sort of bridges the Atlantic divide?
No, not at the moment, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't in the near future. The reality is that the UK still has a particularly close relationship to the United States because it's not a relationship between Number 10 and the White House. It's a relationship between peoples and armies. I served in combat alongside the United States Marine Corps and the 82nd Airborne. I know many businesses on both sides of the Atlantic that are fundamentally linked, and whether you're looking at the fact that my godfather is from the same area that Brendan represents, or the fact that, in fact, I wouldn't be at all surprised to find that Brendan's family are from Limerick, similar to mine, the overlap between our communities is extremely close. And so the opportunity for the UK to remain that link nation is real, even though at the moment we are somewhat more regionally focused.
And finally, Tom, round off this final round for us. Give us your take on transatlantic leadership or lack of it at the moment.
It is being felt. It's being felt on matters such in defense matters in particular. I guess we'll get into this more deeply, but my sense is that you wouldn't have seen the bilateralization of defense deals that you're seeing underway in Europe if the United States were led by somebody else than Donald Trump. But let me just point out that Belarus is actually probably a bad example of sort of looking, or bad place to be looking for the transatlantic leadership vacuum. Belarus is a perfect example of Europe being capable of messing things up, irrespective of who sits in the White House. The brouhaha that Constanze mentioned, the failure to pass sanctions because of Cyprus, is one that responsibility for rests at our feet in Europe. So, not to make a long story short, but Cyprus was led to believe that there was going to be a deal under which there will be tailored sanctions on Turkish ships that are exploring in Cypriot waters. Cyprus does have a legitimate demand that the EU failed to deal with. So it is being felt, the absence of a competent, capable president in the US. But Belarus is an example that almost irrespective of who is in the White House, Albert Einstein or Donald Trump, we will occasionally mess things up ourselves.
Well, thank you very much to all of you for setting the scene there. And I think that the 2 points that come out is we certainly do have a problem, but on the other hand, the relationship, the transatlantic relationship, is much more than just between leaders. We have between lawmakers and between people who work in other political institutions and so on. And we should not allow the gloom to get ourselves into a complete funk about this. So I think the next thing we should look at is NATO, because that is the transatlantic alliance. And we've had a number of dramatic things. We've had the president saying that it's obsolete. We've also, the president's defenders would say, that the president's pressure on European countries has actually led to substantial increases in defence spending, and it's arguable that a more emollient sort of softly approach might not have had quite such a powerful effect on that. We've also had President Macron of France saying that NATO is brain dead, which was an interview with The Economist, and has caused a certain amount of concern. So my next round of questions is really about the future of NATO. Should NATO still be the central transatlantic framework for cooperation, or are we increasingly going to look at coalitions of the capable, coalitions of the willing, coalitions of the scared, coalitions of the threat aware? I think I'll go again to Congressman Boyle to start off with. What should we be trying to do with NATO? Get back to the future, back to where we were, or should we take the current crisis as an opportunity to develop it somehow differently?
I'm going to really attempt to discipline myself to stick with short answers, because this is a conversation. This is a question that you could devote an entire hour to. I would encourage people very quickly, if they get the chance or in any way interested. I wrote an op-ed on NATO and it being on the ballot in this US presidential election. It ran in the Philadelphia Inquirer some weeks ago, so please check that out. I'm a member of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. I care a great deal about it. I think many people here in the United States completely take it for granted and take for granted the sort of post-World War II order that we've lived in for the last 75 years. And I think people here rather naively assume it'll just go on forever automatically unless we give it tender, loving care. Now, to the central question, is NATO obsolete? Should it be disbanded? That kind of line of thinking that you hear from different places actually on the ideological spectrum. No, I push back against all of that. It has been the most successful alliance, certainly in the last century. And I believe that it is the center of the transatlantic relationship. I think that we would be foolhardy to cast it aside. You can supplement it with coalitions of the willing, or as you pointed out, coalition of the scared, coalition of the mutually interested, whatever it may be. But keeping NATO as the central framework, especially when we continue to deal with a hostile aggressor in the East coming out of Moscow. Final point I'll say on this, there's a larger conversation about how we in the West engage/combat the threat of China. There's also a conversation whether or not NATO is really the best forum for that. I'm still a bit of two minds when it comes to that. Nevertheless, though, there absolutely is still today a need for NATO. And in fact, from the US side, support for it needs to be reinvigorated.
Super. I'm going to come to Thomas Waleszek next, and then to Thomas Tugendhat, and then to our other two panelists. So, Thomas, you've seen NATO from the inside as Perm-Rep, and I doubt when you were there, you thought everything was going absolutely brilliantly, even though those were what we would now regard as much happier times. So if you were in charge of evolving and reforming NATO for the coming decade, what would you suggest?
I got out just in time, Edward. So I left literally a few months before Trump came in. So I didn't see the last few years in person, luckily. Look, there's no effective defense of Europe without the United States at the heart of it, simply because there's no way for Europe to effectively deal with the most intense scenario, the one that involves Russia, without the US firepower, strategic and nuclear, and without the sort of courage and robust strategic culture that the United States has. Having said that, the defense of Europe has to become more than NATO, not because NATO is obsolete, but because wars have moved on. If the worst threats to Europe these days come from things such as the ability of Russia and others, increasingly China, to undermine our will to fight through seeding disinformation, financing extremist parties that sow doubt about the wisdom of democracy as such, that's not something that NATO was set up to do. So I firmly believe that NATO must remain at the core of the conventional and nuclear challenge. But in the future, we need a much tighter US-EU defense relationship because of the two institutions, when it comes to things such as dealing with disinformation or, for example, protecting critical infrastructure and other vulnerability, we're not going to be very effective at our defense if our enemies can blackmail us into inaction by threatening to bring down the medical systems, the things that distribute medicines. The power to mitigate against that lie mostly in a realm of regulation. They lie with the EU. So I'm a card-carrying member of the Atlanticist community and a former ambassador to NATO, but I do believe that the biggest gap in defense terms lies in a tighter US-EU relationship, the one that in a meaningful way addresses particularly disinformation and the sort of below Article 5 threats, and then must include dealing with security of critical cyber infrastructure.
So, Tom, how do we are in Britain in a rather difficult position here that I think many people think the NATO-EU cooperation is the absolutely central axis for our future security, but we're slightly on the side of that. What's your take?
Well, we're at the heart of NATO, and for many NATO nations, actually, we are the interface between them and the United States. The United States is such a large organization militarily that it's very difficult for smaller armies to work with them, and so many if you like, use the UK military as an interface, and it means that the UK holds a particular position in European security. It's also worth noting that the United Kingdom's position in intelligence is essential, really, to European security, and that means that there's more than just NATO. There's the Five Eyes community and so on. But I'd actually argue as well that the nature of the threat has changed, and while I having served on NATO operations around the world, I'm very proud to have been part of a fantastic organization. I do think that the organization is not the whole answer. The reality is countries like Japan and South Korea really need to be brought into defense alliances. Countries like Australia, which have observer status, really, which are partners, need to be brought in. And even countries like the United Arab Emirates, which have cooperated with us so well in places like Afghanistan, really do a role within a new alliance.
Constanze, I think it'd be fair to say that Germany has received the full blast of Trumpian displeasure, and that the result has not been entirely positive in terms of the way that the German public regards the transatlantic relationship and NATO in particular. How do you draw up a balance sheet of pluses and minuses, and where are we heading in terms of Germany's involvement in this?
I'm very tempted to say you may think so, Ed, but I couldn't possibly comment. But I won't be lazy. Look, I think Germany's got some very obvious vulnerabilities. And you won't be surprised when I say that I think we should have paid our defense dues, or rather kept our defense commitments, which is what this really is about. We, should never have let Nord Stream 2 get as far as it did. And I think that our trade surpluses are a problem, and we also need to do something about Chinese interference. And I think that, actually, I'm not alone in this. I think the mood in the German commentariat and the for whatever it's worth, strategic community is very much reflects that. The hesitancy comes at the moment, actually, from the Chancellery on a number of these things. And On the other hand, I would say also to you that for anybody who knows what's been going on in German military affairs and strategic culture, there's been a fairly remarkable sea change. I think that the defense minister, who may not have been the best party leader, has actually turned out to be a rather good defense minister and has been really pushing the agenda on these things. And the problem is that the Trump administration isn't helping with that. The Trump administration is making it very easy for the sort of those who I think are culturally anti-American, if you want to call it that, the nationalists on the hard right and on the left, to say, see, we can't trust America, there you are, we need to go off on our own or be better friends with the Russians. But again, you know, I don't want to deflect this all on this current American administration. Our problems are homemade. And we need to do something about them. But the truth is, what I worry about is that there is, I think, in the American strategic community, a real understanding that for NATO to work with the EU, for America to work with the EU, is genuinely useful because the EU provides strategic power assets that are important in a world of competition, and that this is something the Trump administration is not just doesn't understand, but has an ideological objection against. And that's a very real concern, particularly if they're re-elected.
Rachel, you don't represent the Trump administration, you represent yourself, but I'd be very interested to hear your take from the Republican side of the spectrum on this. Do you see, I mean, every American president has complained about European defense spending since even during the Cold War. Do you see some positives to be taken away from the last few years? And what do you think? Assume we have President Trump re-elected, which is certainly a strong possibility. What's that going to mean for NATO?
You know, I think the positives that have come out of it are the outcomes, the increased investments in defense of some of our transatlantic allies. And, you know, there's certainly much to be made of the means to get there. As you know, presidents have been calling for increased defense spending on the other side of the Atlantic, back several administrations of both parties. That's always been, you know, high on priority list. Of course, it's taken on a new edge in this administration. And, you know, if the outcomes, I suppose, are there to speak for themselves. I think it's also important to look at the views of the American people on this. We at the Reagan Institute do a defense-oriented survey, a poll of the American people every year, and there remains high favorability for NATO, support for the alliance itself among both Republicans and Democrats, higher among Democrats and Republicans than Republicans, but over 50% for both voters in both parties. On the other side of that coin, voters in both parties support the idea that our allies need to be doing more, that they're not doing their fair share. That number, of course, higher among Republicans than Democrats, but I think we see bipartisan agreement both for the value of the alliance and the idea that our partners should do more.
I want to turn to China quite soon because I feel that's the sort of the emerging security challenge, and I'll be asking Tom Tugendhat to talk about that. But we've just had a question in from Sanjay Hamidov from Voice of America, which is quite topical, and he says, "What are we doing about the poisoning of Navalny?" This is a clear signal to the transatlantic community that the Putin regime doesn't care what we think, and I think the fact that the chair of the commission looking into the poisoning of Navalny is none other than Mr. Lugovoy, who was in the frame for the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko 14 years ago. It's a very clear sort of middle finger from the Kremlin to international opinion. But that is, along with Belarus, Navalny is the topic of the day. I just want to have whiz around the panel and what should we be doing in response to the Navalny poisoning? Starting with you, Congressman.
Well, shamefully, the United States is doing absolutely nothing. President Trump goes to great pains to never say a cross word about Vladimir Putin and has been asked numerous times. Now, what has to be said, though, is we are 39 days away from a presidential election. And so if we were to have this Same conversation just beyond 39 days if Joe Biden becomes president-elect. I think we'll be having a very different answer. In terms of what we should do, it's interesting. It's easy. I think when we had a post-World War II bipartisan consensus in terms of leading the West, supporting NATO, standing up to first Soviet and later Russian aggression, it might have been easy to take for granted that, of course, an American president, whether Democrat or Republican, whether Truman or Eisenhower or Kennedy or Reagan, of course, they're going to stand up and stand for freedom, stand for democracy, say this is an awful thing and Russia is acting like a rogue regime. What difference does that make? Now that we see the absence of that, I think we realize in retrospect the difference it does make. Just having, I want to use the word normal, American presidents stand up and be able to use the bully pulpit of the Oval Office, which is unlike anything in the world and for which there is no substitute, just to be able to stand up and focus the world's minds on this situation. I am, not to get too partisan, I am hopeful, though, that the situation, might be changing actually very quickly.
Super. Tom, I want to ask you, Tom Tugendhat, that when Navalny was I last saw him when he was in London, and he was here to berate the Brits for not helping with his anti-corruption investigations. And it seems to me that the best response we could make to his poisoning would be to follow up on the money trail that leads to London. So very sort of thickly and dirtily from the heights of wealth and power in Russia. What do you think should be Britain's response and as part of a transatlantic response to the Navalny poisoning?
Well, as you know, Edward, in 2018 in May, we published a report in the Foreign Affairs Committee called Moscow's Gold about dirty money moving through London and the security implications that has for the United Kingdom. We've got to be honest, the two dirtiest jurisdictions in the world, bar none, are the United Kingdom and the United States. We are absolutely filthy. If you are a corrupt, murderous dictator who's genocidally butchered half your people and stolen all the wealth off the other half, use Delaware and use London and you'll be fine.
Can I just put in a good word for the German banks here as well?
They often help as a throughput, but to be truly filthy, you need to be American or British. And I'm afraid this is fundamentally undermining the security of the free world. It is fundamentally undermining the liberties that we enjoy. And as Mr. Navalny has definitely proven, those who in dictatorial countries try to call it out are very severely punished. And this is one of those moments where our actions undermine our words, and we do actually have real power, but it means taking decisions that may cost us a bit. It won't cost us a lot, actually, but it will cost us a bit. And there are a few very loud, very aggressive, and very rich lawyers, accountants, and others, financiers, who are defending effectively modern slavery and modern theft.
Thank you very much for that. You've plugged your committee's report, available just you have to Google it, and the Congressman plugged his op-ed, so the other panelists are welcome to give at least one plug for anything that they've said, written or done recently. Let's do the third lawmaker, Tomáš Valešek. What should Slovakia be doing as part of a transatlantic response to the Navalny poisoning?
Edward, unsurprisingly, you are a much keener observer of Russia than I am, but you already stole the one idea that I did have, which was to do whatever is in not just Slovakia's and EU's powers to keep up, continue, and help Alexander Navalny do his work. What does that mean in practical terms? Look, I think it may mean something like a Navalny Act, which significantly strengthens European central bank supervision over national banks and makes it much more difficult to do the sort of things that Latvian, Danish, Estonian, or Czech banks have done recently, which was to funnel Russian money, not just into private accounts. This is not just the case of Russian oligarchs financing a lifestyle in Monaco and elsewhere, but Czech bank directly financing Marine Le Pen in France with Russian money. I mean, come on, surely we can do better. So I think the best response would be, again, a legislation that tightens bank supervision in Europe to make sure that the Russian money stops corrupting our own systems.
Constanza, Germany played a really important role in this, to the surprise of some people who might have thought that Navalny would go to hospital in some country that's a bit more hawkish towards Russia. But it seems to have had a really quite powerful effect on the German consciousness, and you've touched on this already. But what could Germany do apart from obviously stopping Nord Stream, which is much talked about? Is there anything else Germany could do to respond to the Navalny poisoning?
Well, I think taking in Navalny and treating him in Germany was already a really rather powerful signal to Moscow. I think our larger problem is that the Russians keep misreading us. And the Russians, I think, have been misreading us since not just 2014, but since 2008. This is something, as you know, Ed, that I watch rather carefully. And I've seen just how angry German senior officials were in 2008 and 2014. I remember Medvedev coming to Berlin in 2008, giving a speech about a common European security space from Lisbon to Vladivostok. And I chatted to a very senior German official afterwards, and he just looked at me and said, that was dead on arrival.
Yes.
So I think the larger question here is are we in a position as a European Union, together with our British friends and hopefully with the next American administration, whatever it is, to forge a consensus on how to deal with this? And I think there are huge obstacles here that we're seeing in play on Belarus, on illicit financial flows, on how to deal with Russia's involvement in Syria and Libya and elsewhere. And I would just remind you of one point that I think we're not the least important aspect of all this, is that I think we are seeing a Kremlin and a Putin that is running out of option, that is distinctly weakened in its responses to Lukashenko. It literally doesn't know what to do here. And I think a weakened Putin and a weakened Kremlin presents unique risks for Europe and then the alliance that we need to factor in.
It's very interesting to speculate. Is it that the Russians don't know what Germans think? Is it that they don't understand what Germans think, or they don't care what Germans think?
It's a combination of the above, frankly.
Yeah, right. Okay, Rachel, over to you. Pull this together. You could obviously immediately launch a program of the Navalny Studies program at the Reagan Institute, and that'd be one good way of nominating, of celebrating his work. But what would you like to see as the response to the poisoning?
I think my colleagues on the panel here have had some great ideas, particularly in terms of actions with regard to following the money here, and I'll leave that to the government officials on the call. I think I'll circle back to something that Congressman Boyle started with, which is the rhetoric. We can't underestimate the importance of rhetoric here. Perhaps my plug, along with the report and the op-ed that came up earlier, is just the legacy of Ronald Reagan. And President Reagan and Secretary Shultz began their meetings with Soviet counterparts by discussing a list of Soviet dissidents and those in the gulags. And our president, leaders around Europe would do well to elevate the cause of Russian dissidents, of opposition officials, of democracy activists, to champion their causes and to do that by name.
Good. Well, I want to pivot the conversation now to China for a bit, because I think Constanza is absolutely right that we are dealing perhaps with a Russia that is, or a regime in Russia that's running out of steam, and we'll have a series of problems, perhaps to do with a declining, possibly even increasingly desperate Russia. But the one thing we're not worried about is Russia growing at 8% a year and turning itself into the sort of most powerful economy and possibly the most powerful country in the world. And that is what we're worried about with the People's Republic of China. Now, I'm going to come to Thomas Tugendhat first, because you've been very forceful and prescient on this about the rise of China in parts of the world that are not traditionally seen as sort of vulnerable to Chinese pressure, such as the Caribbean. How can we reconfigure our existing transatlantic security and economic and other ties to deal with the rise of what seems to be a kind of revisionist, rule-breaking People's Republic of China?
Well, I think the first thing to do is to realize what we're dealing with. Fundamentally, what we're dealing with is an attempt to change the operating system of the world. So if you think of it, we've been running off Microsoft, if you like, for the best part of 200 or so years. Code written by people who understood individual rights, basic rules of liberty, limited role of a state that is a jurisdictional body rather than an authoritarian one. And it started with the Dutch, it was evolved through the British, and then the Americans, and of course Western Europeans, and many others have chipped in since, Japan, South Korea, and so on. What China's trying to do is to replace that operating system with a new one. And instead of being a distributed network, what they're actually trying to do is turn it into a hub and spoke model where Beijing is the center and everyone else is, if you like, on the rim of the bicycle wheel connected to the center but not to each other. Now that's a real problem. It's a real problem because, of course, it undermines the liberties that we've traditionally enjoyed. It's also a real problem because it injects single point of failure into the global economy, which is a huge danger for all of us. But it's also a huge problem because it's a very large change. And as anybody who's gone from, as I have, from using Microsoft to using Apple knows, the glitches that appear in the files that you're trying to change are significant. And that's only on your personal computer. Try doing that to a global economy and see what the difference is. The glitches become larger and larger, and things that you took for granted suddenly become open to question.
So what do we do about it?
Well, what we've got to do is we've got to work together. And this is where actually the reality is that our system, if we work together, is actually stronger. And it doesn't require US leadership. What it does require is investment from countries around the world. And that means making sure that we don't allow China, for example, to snap up votes in the UN by using debt diplomacy. We don't allow, the string of pearls that once connected other islands in different parts to extend down to the Caribbean, or to see a second Cuban Missile Crisis being replayed, but this time in Barbados and Jamaica. We need to make sure that we cooperate with each other and we reinforce each other. And that actually means remembering why we founded the GATT talks in the 47 in the post-war period, and remembering that actually the rule of law and the basic principles is what keeps smaller countries safe, not bigger ones. So actually smaller countries should not be bowing to China, but cooperating with each other in order to defend their own interests.
Of course, the paradox here is that we had the beginnings of a kind of global economic governance with the combination of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which, if you put them together, would have created a kind of Western economic bloc that would have been considerably bigger and stronger than China, and would have been in a position to say to China, these are the rules on 5G or intellectual property theft or whatever. And that fell apart for two reasons. First of all, President Trump didn't like it, but secondly, the voters don't like these sort of global free trade deals, the successors to GATT. So, Congressman Barr, how do we build the sort of economic counterweight that Tom is talking about that will allow us to start constraining China's rise and making sure that we are still rule setters and not rule takers?
First, Edward, if I might, I want to push back a bit on something you said in the premise that the voters, the kind of blanket statement that the voters don't like global trade deals. Obviously, the U.S. went in a pretty anti-trade direction in 2016. Interestingly, polls showed a slight majority of both Democratic voters and Republican voters. Historically, for the Republican side, that was a real earthquake. If you had taken any poll of Republican voters in the 1980s, 1990s, they would have been enthusiastically pro-free trade. Trump really helped change the dialogue on the Republican side. That said, though, that doesn't mean the U.S. is blanket anti-trade or that U.S. voters are anti-trade. First, things changed. The polling actually has changed a bit from where it was in 2016. And second, it's not so much that the U.S. public is anti-trade deals. We just approved in Congress the USMCA. I was part of that, being on the Ways and Means Committee. It was the successor to NAFTA 2.0. It was approved overwhelmingly. What voters really don't like, or a certain segment of voters, is wary about trade deals involving countries that have lower labor standards and lower environmental standards than the United States. Particularly, I have to say, even though I'm an environmentalist, it's typically more the former than the latter that animates most voters. So if we're doing a trade deal with Japan, if we're doing a trade deal with countries that are perceived as having, at the very least, the same labor standards as we are, they are much easier to achieve than, say, doing a trade deal with Vietnam. Now, very quickly, in terms of combating China, I'll just say this. The Belt and Road Initiative is ingenious. And from Africa to even now in Eastern Europe, I think even in Italy, the Belt and Road Initiative has helped advance China's reach and China's power. The US, and it's not just under President Trump, I would say for even beyond that, has really been asleep at the switch. We need to invigorate international lending and aid when it comes to infrastructure spending in the rest of the world, because we are being left behind by the Chinese.
Tom, did you want to jump in there? Tom, too.
I think the congressman's absolutely right. And I think looking at coordinating international aid spending and development spending is really important, because at the moment, BRI is effectively using debt traps and debt diplomacy to buy leverage and to buy influence. The reality is the West, and I mean that in the sort of broadest sense, from including countries like Japan and South Korea, as well as the United States, Canada, and Europe, is investing far more in most underdeveloped countries around the world, far more. But what we're not doing is we're not then asking for that leverage to come with signing up to supporting international norms in UN agencies. And so we've seen in the last 20 years, China has gone from leading one UN agency to today leading 4. Now, you may say, well, it's just a UN agency, but actually they set a hell of a lot of the norms that matter. And so I completely agree with Brendan. This is something where we can coordinate, we can work together. And he's right about trade deals as well. It's the perception of inequality, the perception of dumping, if you like, whether labor or environmental or tariffs, that really hurts trade deals.
Tomasz, Slovakia might seem a long way away from China, but in fact, Central Europe is a bit of a battleground. We've seen your neighbours in the Czech Republic bust the People's Republic of China taboo on contacts with Taiwan, with a very large 90-strong delegation going to Taiwan. The Chinese promised retribution for what they call the vicious act, and nothing's happened. Your president, Zuzana Chaputova, stood up for the Czechs when the Chinese are being nasty about them. We've got the 3 Seas summit coming up in Tallinn, which is the sort of Western attempt to push back against the Chinese-run 17+1 development framework. Where does Slovakia fit into this, and who's winning and who's losing?
Look, I mean, just to stake my colors, I'm a firm believer that Slovakia should get out of the, 17+1 now initiative, the one that gangs it's mostly Central European states, more recently now Italy too,
Greece.
With China and Greece, thank you, with China. There's really, but having said that, I mean, there's really nothing to that in terms of substance. What it is essentially, it's an annual photo op. I've asked a senior Slovak diplomat serving in Beijing once, what's the point? What is the upside that you have seen of the agreement? Do we get better access to trade? Do we get better access to the Beijing government? Do we get preferential treatment or this? And this is absolutely nothing. What you get is the opportunity once a year to spend about a month drafting a joint resolution with the Chinese foreign minister, which basically involves a month of torture, fighting back against attempts to get you to agree to China's treatments of Uyghurs and all kinds of other things. So there's really nothing to it. There's almost zero correlation between Chinese investments in Europe and membership in 16 or 18+1, I guess now. To begin with, when you look at where the Chinese money goes, some of it goes to 16+1 countries. Hungary has been a big recipient. Slovakia, virtually nothing. Czech Republic, despite the honorable Speaker of the Senate doing a very honorable thing in Taiwan, is actually quite busy doing business with China. But of course, far more Chinese money goes to Western Europe, whether it's Greece, France, or Britain, for that matter. So, 16+1 is genuinely a sort of a political roadshow and one that really does us no honor. And if it were up to me, I think we should get out.
Rachel, what I'm missing from this is the full-throated moral outrage that one might imagine a regime would attract that keeps millions of its own people in forced labor camps and mind control camps, not just the Uyghurs who Thomas referred to. Now we hear also the same treatment being meted out towards the Tibetans. And it strikes me that President Trump's been quite forceful on the sort of economic case against Chinese aggression and mischief. I'm slightly missing the moral dimension.
Well, you just keep teeing me up to talk more about President Reagan, but let me say, I think I think one thing that we could do in today's context is to shift the conversation about what's really at stake here. So, we hear a lot about the rules-based international order and the post-World War II global order. That doesn't make sense to people. What makes sense to people is to talk about the future of the free world. I mean, that's what's at stake here, right? When we talk about the West that includes Japan and South Korea, right? That's the free world. And this is this is the group of countries that is or should be standing up against a Chinese system that wants to dismantle that system, the free and open system that allows countries and people to interact politically and economically. And it's not just, yes, it's about war and peace. Yes, it's about trade, interactions between states, but that's also about commerce. It's about commercial purchases. It's about travel. It's about health. It's about things that actually matter to citizens on not only both sides of the Atlantic, but in free countries around the world. And that's, I think, the kind of diametric opposition we should be posing against China and the CCP.
And Constanza, the people who criticize Angela Merkel for her stance on Russia, they tend to criticize even more forcefully for the unwillingness, as it's perceived, to confront China. And do you detect any sort of sea change in German attitudes towards China as well, whether on the human rights side or theft of intellectual property from German companies, or any other worries?
I think I do, and I think that the Chancellor here is and probably knows this, is very much on the defensive. And I see three levels of concern. The reports about the treatment of minorities in China, the expansion of the surveillance state, the export of surveillance technology, among other places, to Europe, all of that are really large concerns and have become, I think, very present in German public debate. The second point, and this is different from, say, 10 years ago, is that, like Russia, China is now an actor in the European space. It interferes, it intrudes, it attempts to split. And the difference between Russia and China here is merely that Russia's actions are destructive, aimed at trying to prove that we're no better than Russia, so people shouldn't move. Whereas the Chinese have an interest in at least the single market and the single infrastructure space in Europe working, because that serves their, what I would call, imperial goals. But apart from that, politically, they're very shrewd and very skillful at splitting us wherever they want. However, they're like the Russians. The Chinese are not always good at reading a room. Chinese diplomacy is a case in point. They've, I think, badly overplayed their hand. And when I've seen them in action, I sometimes think you don't know how to do this yet. And it's not clear to me whether they will be. But that I think has contributed as much as anything to the changing of public attitudes and increasing concern in the political community. And finally, of course, there is the point that for a European Union and a Germany that lives off trade and exports, what China does in its own near abroad is not indifferent to us. What China does to Vietnam, to South Korea, to Japan is not indifferent to us. And so we need to have an outlook that is far more global. And I think you saw last week a little noticed event 2 weeks ago, the Germans publishing an Indo-Pacific strategy for the first time. That's not insignificant in this context.
Well, thanks very much indeed. I have to confess I didn't see that. Perhaps you should write about it in the Financial Times and bring it to a wider audience. So we've just got a few minutes left, and I think I want to circle back now to the sort of broader conceptual points, because one of the sort of hallmarks of this administration's approach has been the America First. it's absolutely clear. And the idea that there isn't such a thing as an international community, we have geopolitical competition. It's a tougher world out there. Another phrase that particularly caught my attention was that it was about reciprocity. The idea that the cooperation with reciprocity in the national security strategy. And clearly both of those are important. This cannot be a purely values-based alliance. There has to be some transactional element in it, particularly as the generation passes on that remembers the Berlin airlift or the Berlin crisis or the 1989, all these sort of other very sort of emotional norm-building of events of the past. So I want to ask you all just to now consider in a minute or so, how do we balance the values and the reciprocity, the sort of the transactional element? Because I think whoever is president of the United States, I was going to say after November, I think I have to say actually after January, perhaps not even after that, that whoever is president, this sort of tension between the two elements isn't going to go away. So I'll go to you first of all, Congressman, as the you're probably closest to this issue. Reciprocity, values, transactions, how do we draw the balance?
Yeah, so for President Trump, of course, I mean, he is a highly transactional person in all of his dealings. So I know what side he would err on. I do want to just point out, though, since obviously there has been a rise of populism and not just in the U.S., and related to that is this notion that the U.S. should just retreat within its own borders. That notion, that instinct isn't new. We've always, before Ronald Reagan and his philosophy dominated the Republican Party, there were Bob Taft Republicans who very much were of that view. They were not internationalists. Even Mark Twain himself once quipped, you know, the US, we really only have two friends in the world, Miss Atlantic and Mr. Pacific. So there has always been that instinct to kind of, Europe is messy, stay out of their wars, who needs the rest of the world? We're blessed by being in this on this landmass between two great oceans, and let's just leave them all alone, and they'll leave us alone. That instinct has always been there and will always be there. But I do believe that, you know, the last few years aside, it's generally a minority view within the U.S. because, and this was the case 50 years ago, but it's even more so the case today, we're a part of the larger world, whether we want to be or not. As 200,000 Americans dying have showed us for a pandemic that originated in China, we can't cut ourselves off from the rest of the world if we want to. In terms of the question about transaction versus values and all of this, let's not dismiss the power of soft power. Joe Nye, the former dean of Harvard's Kennedy School, has written at length on this topic, and I'm amazed at the sort of soft power that the United States in particular continues to have and wield around the world. It's more valuable than I even recognized until I started in this position 6 years ago. So I think that these things will clearly continue. I think we in the US, though, have to be a little bit more thoughtful about how we deploy that soft power. It's a great tool to have, but unfortunately it's something we don't use as intelligently or as strategically as we could.
Rachel, let's hop across the aisle to you next, and give us your take on perhaps can we rekindle the internationalist side of the Republican Party?
Yeah, you know, I want to kind of key in on something that you brought up in the question, which is this concept of America First that's taken hold, particularly in the Republican electorate here. You know, it implies that when it comes to alliances, that the U.S. takes on allies kind of out of the goodness of our heart, that we build alliances to do good for other people. And that's just not true. Every country builds alliances because it's in their own strategic interest, and NATO is in ours. And so I think, you know, we could use a bit of a narrative shift here that NATO is America first, right? NATO is every country is in an alliance because that alliance prioritizes the interests and values of that country and the interests and values that every country in that alliance shares. And so this idea that it's just something we do to be nice to other countries certainly isn't borne out in history or the enduring value of those alliances in the light of today's challenges.
Constanze, Germany is in a certain sort of paradox here, that it's probably the most, in terms of what it says, the most multilateral country you can imagine. Tremendous belief in rules-based international order and cooperation and all these sort of very high-minded things. When it comes to what Germany actually does, there's quite a sort of hardcore of German self-interest. Am I being unfair?
No, but that's always been the case. I mean, that's even when Germany wasn't fully sovereign and the occupying powers statute still held until '89, that was the case. We're just better at hiding it. So honestly, I have little time for this particular line of argument. Honestly, I think what we all need to understand is that in a world that's characterized by two things: great power competition and deepening interdependence, that we cannot decouple from without cutting off our economies from global trade. We are all collectively stronger when we act together, and we are all weaker because of this environment. And so we really need each other. And it seems to me that even if you read younger American conservative thinkers like Bridge Colby, for example, they acknowledge this. So America needs Europe. We certainly need America. But in an interdependent world, the assets that Europe has to bring to the table are actually rather significant. Conversely, if we undercut each other, if we play against each other, that gives the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, and others, and the Turks, I sadly have to add, a fairly easy game. And so I would say it's in none of our interest. It is not a way to pursue America first, to beat Europe around the head. And I'm begging that Britain will play a constructive role in all of this, and that we as a European Union will have a good relationship with the United Kingdom after Brexit. It's in all of our interests as well.
Tom, Constanze is begging you. Will you respond?
You weren't listening, were you?
I was listening. Look, I think the challenge here is that it's just as much in everybody's interest to get the right relationship. And as indeed, as Rachel was saying earlier, we don't do this deal because it's in any act of generosity. Having the tripwire for UK defence 2,000 miles further east from Dover is fundamentally in our national interest. And the question as to how we work together and how we structure this agreement is now the challenge. The challenge, however, it runs two ways, because the challenge for the European Union is how to have a relationship that isn't solely based on the structural agreements that the European Union has currently got. And the challenge for the UK is how to build structures with groupings that will very often attempt to stitch up deals before they walk into the room with you. And that does pose real difficulties for both sides. And so we'll need a different approach. My guess is that the different approach will end up being mostly Franco-British, because the real truth of European defence is that it is Franco-British, and others come along occasionally, maybe never.
Thomas, you've got literally 30 seconds to give us. I've always thought of you as both a very insightful but also fundamentally optimistic person. Has this conversation we've just been having stoked your optimism or dented it?
Oh, the Central Europeans being shorted again. Same old story. Look, optimistic. I do believe when and if change comes in DC, much will change. I think much of the talk of autonomy that you hear in the EU these days will fall away. Not all will still be going for autonomy in vaccines or in components for electric cars, because that's not a response to Trump. That's a response to tightening global supply. But surely the talk of defense autonomy is going to go away. And I hope we will have a resurrection of joint leadership on climate change and on China. Those are two items screaming for much closer collaboration.
Well, thanks so much. And annoyingly, you've stolen my concluding joke, which is that we've got through this entire conversation without talking about strategic autonomy, which I would regard as an entirely appropriate amount of time to devote to it. But giving it a glancing mention in the final seconds is pretty good. I'm also aware that we've only touched on Turkey, which is a huge problem. The word Iran appeared only once with no nouns, verbs, or adjectives attached to it, and that's another huge one. There's also the Middle East and Africa and so many other global problems, but we only had an hour. But I think I want to thank all of you very much for your making time in your schedules for this and for your attentive and thoughtful and articulate contributions to our discussions. We've been listening to our panelists, Congressman Brendan Boyle from Pennsylvania, Rachel Hoff from the Ronald Reagan Institute, Constanze Stelzenmüller from the Brookings Institution, Tom Tugendhat, Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and last but not least, Tomasz Walaszek from the Slovak Parliament. So that concludes almost the CEPA Forum for 2020, our first virtual one. And it just remains for me to hand over to my CEPA colleagues, Geisha Gonzalez and Alina Polyakova at CEPA HQ in Washington. But from me in London, Edward Lucas, thank you very much indeed.
Wonderful. Thank you, Edward. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for that amazing discussion. Alina Polyakova, our president and CEO, now joins me. Alina, what a week.
It was an incredible week of discussions. 5 days, 5 U.S. senators, a Congress member, so many high-level government officials. It was our first virtual forum, as many others are experimenting with this format as well. But what an incredible set of substantive conversations, of incredible speakers, and a wonderful audience that submitted so many difficult questions to all of us. Yeah. So what did you think was the most interesting part of the forum?
Wow. Well, that actually is probably the hardest question. I think when we first set out to do this conference over 5 days and each focusing on a pillar of work that, we find at CEPA very interesting and core Great. And we are back. Thank you, Edward. Thank you to our panelists for such an amazing discussion. I'm joined by Alina Polyakova, who is our president and CEO, for this, wrap-up discussion. Alina, what a wonderful week.
And an incredible week of conversations. We set out to do CEPA Forum for the first time in our history virtually. It was a big experiment. And I have to admit, I have been so surprised in a good way by the level of conversation the speakers were able to bring in and the incredible engagement we saw from our live audience who tuned in later. Geisha, what was your most favorite part? What did you find most interesting about the forum?
I mean, I have so many favorites, but I think I will start by saying that kicking off the discussion with Secretary General Stoltenberg, talking about his 2030 vision, having colleagues talk about how, the future is built not just for the next generation, but with the next generation. And then having today kick off with our Transatlantic Leadership Fellows and alumni from across the Atlantic, talking about, recognizing the leadership of Senator Portman and Murphy, really tied the bow for me in terms of what I found to be the most interesting, what I found to be truest to what I think CEPA's core mission is. And so that, I would say that is the highlight. There are many little pieces here and there that I find, we could spend the entire wrap up talking about. But what did you find most interesting? And if I may add, like most provocative thing that was said this week?
Well, we started Monday's sessions, as you said, with the Secretary General, and then this very high level geopolitical conversation. I think all of us are asking questions about what is the world going to look like, not just because of the current pandemic, but certainly I think because of the pandemic, that question is top of mind. I thought the conversation that we opened with set the tone, a provocative tone, where we had Kori Schake talking about the abdication of U.S. leadership from her perspective. We heard Frank Fukuyama from Stanford talk about the problems we're experiencing in the United States domestically and how that's preventing us from having a more engaged global role. And then I think the conversations just went on from there. I think my highlight for the conference as a whole was that we were able to have such an incredible group of bipartisan leaders. And I think that to me, that signals that in this time where it feels like we're in the midst of this presidential election, it feels like there's a lot of discontent and it feels like there's more that divides us than unites us. I think that was proof that there is a desire and there is a huge amount of agreement among Republicans and Democrats, among transatlantic leaders from all different parties, from all sides of the political spectrum about our common challenges. Cory Booker,
that's great.
Senator Risch, our Transatlantic Leadership awardee, Senator Portman and Murphy. It was just an incredible mix of what bipartisanship looks like. Right. And, I think the one amazing thing about the digital domain and how we're holding these kinds of conversations now is that we're able to bring in our partners and friends and allies from Europe, the foreign minister of Lithuania, Linas Linkevičius, our Freedom Fighter awardee for his work on Belarus. I thought his words were really inspiring. So there's just so many highlights that I could go through. Senator Whitehouse,
no, he was, yes,
who joined us for our day 3 panel on democratic resilience with the VP of the European Commission, Vera Jourova, always an interesting voice. I mean, I don't want to go back through it all. I would encourage everyone to have a look.
Go through the agenda.
But I thought this was an incredible way to showcase what we here at CEPA do and how committed we are to strengthening the transatlantic bond.
And then, I would absolutely agree with you. I will say that I thought that perhaps some of the conversations would turn a little bit negative. I think we live in this environment where, the pandemic is still something that is very much front of mind of everyone. There are strained relationships between US and Europe, clearly. So I did think that we were going to have perhaps a little bit more somber conversations throughout the week. And I'm surprised that they turned out to be so optimistic about the future, focusing on the things that, like you said, like unite us versus divide us. I thought that was incredibly, that was a theme that was across the board, something that just continued to come up and I found to be interesting. You didn't answer my question about the most provocative thing that was said this week, but I probably could answer a little, we did do some new things that CEPA has not worked on in the past, right? So particularly looking at the transatlantic digital agenda and what that means and what questions are still unanswered. So, anything there or anything throughout the week that you thought was really provocative? Because I could dig into that one. But
well, look, I do think the opening panel set the provocative tone for the conference. But it's true that CEPA is starting a new effort to engage on digital issues, which from our perspective are one of the wedge issues that we could have a shared purpose or become a divisive issue between Europe and the United States. And our panel on day 4 really zeroed in on that. I think one of the more provocative things that we discussed that day was this notion of whether we're already sort of past the point of no return when it comes to our ability to protect an open internet, or whether we're already living in splinternet. And I was surprised to hear that most of the panelists seemed to agree that we were in splinter internet, fragmented internet world. But again, the optimism was there that it didn't mean that we had nothing to protect. I think the urgency of what we need to do together has been greatly accelerated by the current pandemic. And I got that sense from all of our panels. And I think it really encapsulated the theme of the conference this year, which we came up with before the pandemic started, Disrupted Future Shared Purpose. How do we map a new transatlantic decade together? And of course, none of this would have been possible without the wonderful CEPA team. So thank you, Geisha, our Senior Director for Programs and Strategy, for all the work you did. Behind the camera, behind everything nobody sees, the incredible work of Michael Newton, who's been working behind the scenes with our wonderful sound and audio engineers and video engineers, Carlota Nunez, who has made so many of the incredible videos and is in transatlantic fashion working from Europe, like many of our colleagues. And of course, the entire CEPA team, our program director, Lauren Speranza, for Transatlantic Defense and Security, program director, Karina Rebezia, for Democratic Resilience, Milda Boyes, our director for Transatlantic Leadership, and the entire teams and all those programs. It was just really amazing to see everyone come together. And all the other staff that worked, I think, endless nights. Christina Brown, Eleanor Anderson. I don't want to, again, list everyone. I think everybody knows that we're so grateful for everyone pitching in, making this experiment a success.
Yes. Thank you, Alina. And thank you for your leadership. I mean, even having the foresight of the theme before the pandemic, it really set the tone for what we wanted to do and what we wanted to cover. So really grateful for your leadership. This is our first CEPA forum that we're hosting it. We're hosting it virtually, but just really pleased with how the team came together for this. It takes a village. It always takes a village, even in the digital space. I'd like to thank our supporters that stuck with us and really were the reason that we could host this event in this format. So want to thank NATO's Public Diplomacy Division, Lockheed Martin Corporation, Bell Helicopter, American Friends of Czech Republic, Friends of Slovakia, and then Craig Newmark Philanthropies for their support of our digital work that we got to showcase a bit of on Thursday.
And last but definitely not least, we're so lucky to have an incredibly supportive board here at CEPA. Larry Hirsch, the chairman of the CEPA board, opened the conference. Wes Mitchell was one of the speakers talking about the future of administration's priorities for Europe and the Transatlantic Alliance. He's also our vice chair here at CEPA, and the rest of CEPA's board of directors who've been incredibly supportive of this entire event. And who participated in so many of our sessions, incredibly, taking the time to do that. I'm just grateful for the organization that we have here at CEPA, everyone on the team, the board, our National Advisory Council, our sponsors, our friends in Europe. Yes. Thank you, everyone, for making this a big success. And with that, it's a wrap.
It's a wrap. Thank you for tuning in.
And goodbye.
Bye.
As we look into the future, it looks incredibly uncertain, unpredictable, and even disruptive. We live in a contested world with unprecedented global challenges, disrupted by competition from Russia and China, ongoing crises, and the rapid digital transformation of our societies. In the near term, the international order will look drastically different from what it does today.
NATO is the most successful alliance in history for two reasons: our unity and our ability to change when the world is changing.
Perhaps NATO's most defining moments were when we used our military dominance to protect the most vulnerable among us.
This era we live through is full of uncertainties, full of destabilization, and it is a real stress test for our democracies.
We really can enjoy being free, but we know that as we speak, many nations fighting for their freedom, for sovereignty, for independence, for territorial integrity.
My example vividly demonstrates the dangers of authoritarianism, depriving people's rights, putting them in jail. When individuals' freedom and rights are not protected, our society and our way of living could change very rapidly.
There is a nation state which has declared war on all of Western-style democracy.
Compared to 6 years ago, Russia is much more emboldened to work inside our countries.
We have to form close partnerships with allies who share our values, and that's going to be critical, having a global anti-disinformation network.
I believe the biggest task of the transatlantic community will be to defend democracy in the face of unprecedented challenges from countries like Russia and China.
Living in a democratic state provides multiple paths to justice and to personal success, and ideally, recognition that all human beings are equally worthy.